Okay, welcome back everybody. The highlight of the morning, Boa speaking in his own words. How do you introduce somebody who needs no introduction? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about him, though probably most of you know this. As we've heard, Boa studied in Yale. He has a degree of degrees from there, but also an honorary degree from McGill, like Sally, we heard yesterday. He's written and published widely on issues of globalization, sociology of law and the state, epistemology, social movements, and the World Social Forum. He's director of the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, and amongst his the many projects that he's run and the many individuals he's gathered around him to do valuable work, one of his great strengths is inspiring and gathering people around him, is the current project, which he told me proudly, very well funded, called ALICE, Leading Europe to a New Way of Sharing the World Experiences, which is funded by an advance grant of the European Research Council from July 2011 for 5 years. And his books have appeared in English, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, French, German and Chinese. These books include, as we've heard this morning, Towards a New Common Sense, a New Legal Common Sense, The Rise of the Global Left, Epistemologies of the South, and then this year a book called If God Were a Human Rights Activist. They'd crucify him, wouldn't they?
That's a good
Now,
response.
Boa has received innumerable prizes, which I can't read you the list, but it really has. And in fact, I've been on prize committees which have given Boa prizes. And more recently, I was asked to recommend somebody else other than Boa for an extremely rich prize. And I did recommend this person, but when they asked one of their questions at the end, is there anybody else you would consider of his stature? I said, Boa. Don't worry, he didn't get the money anyway. So we look forward to hearing Boa in his own words, and depending on how long he takes, there may or may not be time for questions. We have to finish at 1, apparently. Thank you.
Thank you,
Boa.
David. Thank you so much. Take some water. Okay, so maybe.
Bring your water.
Thank you so much, David, for your introduction. It is being a... Oh, it's really a memorable day for me, and to be here with all of you and try to discuss parts of my work with you, the ones that are more related to sociology of law. And of course, I'll try to be brief. I don't know, I'd like to have some minutes for discussion, because I've sensed that you are anxious to be more involved in the discussion. Well, my 1994 book, Toward a New Common Sense, among other things, I think was a tale of two globalizations. On one side, the hegemonic globalization from above, powered by dominant social groups, institutions, and knowledges, and the counter-hegemonic globalization from below, powered by translocal articulations of social movements, organizations, struggles resisting against domination, oppression, and exclusion, and offering alternatives. In my view, modern science, law, and politics were at the core of the contradictions between these two globalizations. In the second edition of the book that you have, I dropped the concern with science, and more broadly with knowledge, and focus on law and politics. At the end of a century that had ostensibly abandoned utopia and even had given it a bad name, I conclude the 1994 book with a blueprint of an utopian framework self-consciously titled Don't Shoot the Utopist. In 2002 book, after 25 years of solidary involvement with social movements, culminating with my active role in the World Social Forum, I became more interested in the mechanics of real progressive social transformation, and I consequently dropped the chapter on utopia and replaced it with a chapter called Can Law Be Emancipatory? That is the last chapter, chapter 8 in the book, in which I put forward a normative theory about the ways in which subaltern, oppressed, marginalized groups can in fact use an instrument that has been basically an hegemonic instrument to reproduce domination, to promote their struggles and to provide them with better lives and better aspirations of a better life. So that was the idea, so to say. So how is it possible to do a counter-hegemonic use of an hegemonic instrument? That's basically the question I raise. And I say in the book that it is possible, it is difficult, but it is possible, provided that you have to politicize your struggles before they become juridical. Because all my experience, the social movements that have succeeded, be they gays and lesbians, be they peasants, women, they politicize their movement and then they take it to the courts or the parliaments, and therefore you have to politicize the struggles before you make them a juridical issue. And the conditions for that are laid out in the chapter. Well, 15 years later, I see the need to revisit this idea. Not only because, in fact, many social movements over the years have been using this, and I have been participating with some of them. The indigenous people is one good example. The landless movement in Brazil is another. Women's movement and peasant movement in Mozambique. But on the other side, I have seen the backlash. I have seen that many of the legal advances have been reverted, that many defeats have also occurred in this process. And therefore, I became very much aware that this answer, if it is to be answered positively, that is to say, law in fact can be emancipatory, it has to be made more complex and probably more conditioned than I thought before. So I think I started this presentation first to show, in a brief sketch, it's just characterizing the topics, and then I move on. The main characteristics of our time, as I see them, is a kind of a radical diagnosis that allows me then to see the fate of legal reformism, as I in fact described it and analyzed it into ordinary common sense, and a kind of an epistemological turn which took place some 10 years ago, which I've been calling the epistemologies of the South, which in a kind of a reductionist way can be designated as a post-colonial turn or a decolonial turn in my theory. I think it's more complex than that. But in any case, I'm going to revisit legal reformism on the basis of these epistemologies. And of course, I'll describe briefly these epistemologies for you. So what are the conditions of our time? I think that we live in difficult and very unsettling times because the popular classes and oppressed social groups in general are today confronted with 7 major threats to their already precarious livelihoods and therefore questioning the prospects for a better life in the future. These threats are not new. What is new is their articulation and the fact that they are present everywhere in the world, but in very different ways. And therefore we cannot, of course, generalize too much on this. But they are so serious in many cases that some people have been calling for a civilizatory change, that we are, in a sense, at the end of a kind of a civilizatory paradigm, and probably in the in-between terms, between an old paradigm and a new paradigm that has not yet arrived, and we don't even know how this new paradigm will be. So, what are these threats? The threats, there are 7 threats. 7 is a magic number. Why 7, not 8? Well, that's... Well, the first one is the disfiguring of the state. A state that was created to develop non-mercantile relationships among citizens is now the main agent in the process of re-mercantilization, of recommodification of relationships. Because there were 3 principles of modern regulation: the principle of the state, the principle of the market, and the principle of the community. And we are at a time in which the principle of the market dominates the other principles. And this has an impact on the state, which I call the disfiguring of the state. In the paper, I go, at length on this. The second one is the hollowing out of democracy. I think that the critique of social and economic rights, of citizenship entitlements, are creating an increasing conflict between two basic impulses, which are on the basis of our democratic arrangements in our societies. The impulse toward infinite accumulation of capital and profit, and the impulse to citizenship entitlements based on popular sovereignty. And therefore, these two impulses are contradictory. But in a sense, for some time, they have been made compatible, and they have been compatible, particularly in Europe. That's very clearly the case. But I think that now social inequality has become so exponentially great at this point. Concentration of wealth among countries, between rich and poor, and of course within each given country, that sometimes the powerful groups in society are acquiring a veto power over the lives and the prospects of life of the powerless groups in society. More and more people are dependent on philanthropy, on the whims of the donations of other people, not based on universal rights, but really donations. Charity, one would say. That's the old term for this. And if this veto power goes on, and the workers very often in our business world these days, they feel very much that they are at whims of the employer in a way that they were not before. And therefore, this veto power may be leading to a situation very unsettling for me. Is that this veto power, sometimes, if I decide the lives of the others based on the power I have, I can behave like a fascist. I'm not a fascist, I'm a Democrat. But my power over the others is so uncontrolled that it looks like a fascistic type of power. That's what I've been calling social fascism. And I've been saying that we are running the risk of living in societies that are politically democratic but socially fascistic because of this inequality of wealth. So this, I think, is the danger for democracy. The third threat is the destruction of nature. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but just to tell you that the destruction of nature, that is to say, the possibility of restoring the vital cycles of nature, creates a very interesting contradiction between two temporalities. Look at the news. There is a temporality of urgency. Climate change. If we don't act now, tomorrow is too late. The United Nations says already that 2015, if nothing is done, global warming will be irreversible. So, urgency. On the other side, we know that in order to accomplish differences in production, in consumption, in social relations, with a new form of ecological understanding of nature, will take generations. So a temporality of paradigmatic change. A very long temporality. So on one side, an immediate temporality, on the other side, a very long temporality. Unfortunately, the political temporality of our societies is the electoral time. It's 4 years. And that's why politicians very often are not very much interested in these issues. The fourth threat is the valuation of labor. I think it's one of the major transformations that we are witnessing because neoliberalism managed one very important objective, which was that labor is now a global resource, but there is no global labor market. On the contrary, markets are fragmented, but the resource, as a resource, there is a global resource for the market. So there are two basic distinctions in our modern times, 20th century, that are getting blurred. The first one is between paid and unpaid labor. More of labor that used to be paid is not paid anymore. The time that people prepare to work for the next day. The letters of recommendation of intention and CVs that they have constantly to write. The interviews, they go so often in vain. All this is unpaid labor, sometimes in some big business enterprises, to be at the disposal of your employer 24 hours a day, as in the city, as you know. So there are many ways in which some labor that used to be paid probably is not paid anymore. We knew of women, we knew of the unpaid labor of the women at home, but now there is more than that. For instance, no payment of extra work. You know that the United States, in Sociology of Labor, we have developed a new concept. It's called the wage theft. The wages that are not paid. And in fact, if you go to the Google, you can see a current of sociological work on the wage theft. So I think that this is a major threat. The fifth threat is the commodification of knowledge. More and more, the value of knowledge is the market value of knowledge. And our universities, in fact, are called upon to produce skilled labor, which, of course, they have always done, but now they are called upon to become a market themselves and to behave like business enterprises. And this, of course, creates a danger for knowledge. The sixth threat is the recolonization of difference. The accounts of colonialism have not been settled. That's why you have so many people dying in the Mediterranean shores. The Mediterranean is now a liquid cemetery. And is not the product of mafias. It's the product of unresolved questions of European colonialism. And the people that don't die in the liquid cemetery die in the dry cemetery, the desert before the Mediterranean shores. So I think that this is based, the way the immigrants are being treated in Europe and elsewhere shows that there are forms of radical racial violence, xenophobia, Islamophobia, ethnic cleansing, ethnic profiling, policies of immigration that in fact are policies against immigration. Asylum, you have thousands of people in concentration camps in Europe, and I visit some of them in Denmark and in Italy and so on. So I think that this is what I call the recolonization of difference. And finally, the criminalization of protest. I'm not sure that whether today are more protests than before, but I see protests being criminalized more and more in urban settings and also in rural settings. I'm more familiar with rural settings, even though I've been associated with the Indignados movement and the Occupy movement. You can see how they have been very often criminalized and intimidated. In rural areas, of course, peasants and indigenous peoples and so on have been confronting the mega projects of oil, of mining, oil drilling, hydroelectric mega projects. And whenever the indigenous people resist against these projects, they are put in prison very often. We have this time in the continent, in Latin America, more than 200 indigenous leaders that are in prison because of terrorism. They are considered terrorists. Why are they terrorists? Because they block roads, not to allow the company's trucks to enter their territories. And these laws have been, the anti-terrorist laws that the Security Council has directed, in fact, has been used against this. They were not intent for that. They were intent to fight terrorism. These people are not terrorists, but they are being used for that. So these threats, in my view, are very serious. Probably we live in a kind of a relatively protected part of the world. And it is less protected today than it was before. I come from Southern Europe. You know what's happening in Greece, what will happen probably tomorrow in Portugal, and in Spain, and probably in Italy. We are not protected anymore. And in fact, the surprise is that the policies that are being applied in Europe were the policies that Europe always applied in the so-called third world. At the time, they were good because they know what applied to us. All of a sudden, they apply to us. What a surprise. The IMF is so anti-democratic and so on. It has always been so. But once it was Tanzania or Brazil or Mexico or India or Indonesia, well, that was the third world. But now it's Europe. It's coming home. So I think that this calls for a kind of a society in which I'm really very concerned that even though we live in politically democratic societies, there is what I call a dronification of politics. Drones, the military drones. Why is that? It's because the military drones, for me, are the metonym of a form of power so much more powerful than that of the enemy that it does not even have to worry about retaliation, does not imagine having to prepare itself for defeat, does not celebrate victory because victory is a computer routine. It does not even have heroes, either because its heroes are computer bytes that do not even know their masters. The major characteristics of the dronification of power is that it never follows the same rules as the enemy. And that's why there are no adversaries, they are just enemies. To use Chantal Mouffe's distinction, from agonic democratic conflicts, we are in many ways going into antagonistic, despotic conflicts. And this concentration of power, the dronification of politics, take place at the level of the political, non-declared wars, non-declared states of exceptions throughout the world these days, but also in the economy. Here in the city, in one day to the next, they can ruin a country through speculation on bankruptcy of a given country. It's a drone. The ways the markets operate is a drone that may destroy a country from day to the next, without any changes in the economy of the countries. And the media, the concentration of power in the media, is becoming very often also kind of drones. So I think in order to fight this, one would need some very general action principles. I follow action principles to propose to you. Decommodify, that is to say, we have many aspects of our lives cannot be commodified. Our sociability cannot be commodified. Knowledge should not be utterly commodified. Of course, we are in favor of patents, but patents is one thing. But to reduce all the university work and research to value knowledge with a market value is something else. We have to decolonize our social sciences, because the social sciences have been an history of the victors, of the winners, told by the winners. To democratize, and finally to depatriarchalize. They are very general action principles. What can I do with can law be emancipatory? What legal reform is? Seems that we are dealing there with piecemeal type of transformation. These are a very broad picture. How can you go from the broad picture to the small changes that our life is made of? We'll never accomplish a revolutionary, change. This time is, past for them. So how can we square these ideas with the big picture of the backlash on social progressive struggles that we are experiencing today? So I think that reformism, in fact, started in Europe as an alternative to revolution. While revolution called for a violent, abrupt rupture and break with the previous order, reformism was a peaceful, piecemeal, gradual, incremental transformation to a better society. Originally interesting, reformism and both reformism and revolution want to bring about a new society, socialist society. But in the process, in fact, it was a way of dealing with the changes in capitalism and not changes of capitalism. And in fact, this reformism, they were you saw the two paradigms. In Western Europe, reformism, and of course the Soviet bloc revolution. But there were many countries that were not part of it. We are celebrating, we should celebrate actually, the 60th anniversary of a couple of countries, the non-aligned countries, that got together in Bandung in 1955 to reclaim their sovereignty, their idea of deciding for themselves the best model, neither the Soviet model nor the capitalist model. We want our own model. There was Nehru there, of course. There was Nasser there was Tito there was Suharto there were many other people that they didn't want to align themselves with the major powers. So they became non-aligned. But this movement, in fact, faded away for several reasons, and I'm not going to go into that. So when I wrote this piece, Can Law Be Emancipatory, quite frankly, reformism was losing steam already in Europe. One could see the decline of the crisis of social democracy. The crisis of the welfare state were already there. But I was impressed by the progress in some social struggles, for instance, in Latin America. Because at the time, progressive governments were coming to power in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Brazil, in Argentina, on the back of very wide and powerful social mobilizations. And they, in fact, were trying to make progressive social transformation with some similarities with social democracy in Europe. And they were democratic. That is to say, they were not really, and it's very interesting, that they called themselves doing revolutions, but they were not. They came to power through elections, and of course they were ratified by elections, democratically. But they called Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, citizen revolution in Ecuador, communitarian revolution in Bolivia, all of them by democratic means. And in fact, in 2003, when Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, came to power, he said, well, what we are going to do is to build in Brazil a social democracy in our style. And I lament that Europe is abandoning social democracy, the welfare state, while we are trying to retrieve this heritage as an important one. So I think that at that point, my analysis, can law be emancipatory, would reflect more of those realities of those countries than probably the realities of Europe. But they were, my work also in Africa would call me that probably, and of course we had already South Africa, there was an hope that these possibilities of law being emancipatory could be a very good question and to be answered in positive terms. I still continue to believe that it can be, but it's more complex. Why is it more complex today? Because of my experience with the constitutional processes in Ecuador and Bolivia, in which what we saw is that the epistemologists of the South, as I'm going to call them, these constitutional processes were constitutional processes that were running away from the Western-centric ideologies and ideas. They were using, for instance, national words, national concepts in non-colonial languages to symbolize the political transformation they were aiming at. For instance, summa causa is a key concept in the Ecuadorian constitution. What is that? Good living is a catch-all word that describes the idea of good living. So they eliminated the concept of development and replaced by summa causa. The Bolivians replaced by summa camaña, which in Aymara is basically the same thing. Buen vivir in Spanish, good living, in reciprocity, and particularly with nature. And then they develop a different concept of nature, the concept of Pachamama, Mother Earth, as a living being that gives energy and life to us, and therefore cannot be treated as a natural resource. So when I was a consultant to the Constitution, one of the deputies of the opposition came to me and said, well, Professor Boaventura, he was a well-known social scientist and lawyer and so on, you are consulting here, tell me something. These indigenous people are crazy, aren't they? So they want to give rights to nature. Because the Constitution of Ecuador in Article 71 says the rights of the Pachamama, the rights of nature. That is to say, nature has rights of its own. And therefore, it should be protected as some entity that has rights, as human rights have rights. This is quite innovative. And I said, well, they are crazy, of course, from our point of view. You have been trained, as I have been trained, in the Western conceptions, and nature for us is a natural resource. And therefore, a natural resource cannot have rights. But the nature that is in the Constitution is not this nature, is Mother Earth. Is a different concept of nature, and that nature is a living being, is really the source of life. Because for many indigenous people, the oil that is drilled from the ground is the blood of nature. And the blood of nature is connected with our own blood. And that's why some of the indigenous people in Colombia once said, if we go on drilling oil in our sacred territories, we'll commit suicide. Because our blood is taken away from us as you drill the oil in our community. So a completely different view of the nature, of the world. What, is this stupid? It's just ignorant? Is a residue of the past? Or it tells me something else? Well, I was being president of a kind of a tribunal that we organized in Quito on these questions of ecology, and I saw an alliance developing. Young urban ecologists, young people, youth, together with indigenous peoples. They don't know Quechua, they don't know Aymara, they have never been in Amazonia. But the concept of Mother Earth resonated to their ecological struggles. And we saw some kind of alliance between these two groups. So I was struck by that. And in fact, the idea of the epistemologies of the South that I've been developing is an idea that calls upon, I can describe it very briefly in this way. The epistemologies of the South are procedures to recognize, valorize, and validate knowledges that have been developed in the struggles against capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. They are knowledges born in struggle. They are not the knowledges of the winners. Sometimes they are losers. They never reach our universities because what we teach at the university is knowledge after the struggle, and usually the version of the victors of those struggles, of the winners, not the losers. So it's how can we capture that experience? How this has been created? I developed in the paper, I'm not going to have time to do that. Why, in fact, you have to develop these new epistemologies in order to understand the world today. And to understand one thing that became clear to me only after I wrote that book, and will part of the new book by Cambridge, I think, that will be developing in the near months, in the next months, is this idea that if you look carefully now at what happened from the 16th century onwards, what was is that we developed an abyssal line between metropolitan societies and colonial societies. And our universal principles from modernity apply in metropolitan societies, never in the colonies. The other side of the line has never been relevant for our legal and social theories. And you have now to bring that other side of the line into the discussion. Why they have been invisible? I give you an example. Harry Arthurs know that very well. At the end of the 19th century, all of us celebrate in Europe and in the world the idea that workers are going to have rights, and therefore subsidies and so on, and working hours and so on. So it's the beginning of the workers' right of labor law, which is going to be the embryo of the welfare state, because it's through labor that the workers get to citizenship rights. It's through labor. So it is a marvelous process of a beneficiary law, protection, social protection through law. At the very same time, on the other side of the line in the colonies, labor law is penal law, is forced labor, and sometimes even slave labor. But these two images never can see each other on the mirror because there is an invisible line that separates them. So social democracy in Europe was conquered and obtained at the cost of the plundering of natural resources on the other side of the line. So law as emancipation goes together with law as plundering. Was it just in the time of colonialism, or is now? Well, my sad experience in Latin America tells me that it's also now. I mean, the abyssal line goes on being drawn through the geographies through which we create zones of non-being, as Frantz Fanon would call them, in which people, in fact, are made invisible. They are irrelevant for our struggles. They are not even considered in our discussions. And this is considered because colonialism did not end with historical colonialism. It reproduced itself through neocolonialism. Remember a marvelous book that all of us, you should be reading, probably Pierre is going to put that in required reading, on neocolonialism by Nkrumah, which is 1965. And then the other concept, internal colonialism. That this still goes on in our societies. And I give you now the example. All these beautiful cases of progressive legal transformation in Latin America were developed at the cost of an unprecedented exploitation of the natural resources. Because of the move of China to become a major power, the demand for natural resources, for raw materials, for agricultural products is tremendous these days. So in order to do that, you need land grabbing. It so happens that, as in colonialism, for this project, there is nobody in there. Terra nullius was the concept. No man's land. Of course, there were indigenous people there. Now these people are the indigenous people there. And they have rights. They are considered to have rights. But the land grabbing is invading their territories. Is expelling them from their territory. So all of a sudden, they become obstacles to development. And they are assassinated by private armies. And they are considered terrorists, and they are persecuted. And sometimes this happens by so-called progressive governments. Because the model of development is neoliberalism. And neoliberalism really does not care about these questions, about the recognition of difference if it interferes with accumulation. And the countries, in fact, are trapped because in order to have public health, to have public education, they need incomes. These incomes come from the incomes from raw materials, from the exploration of raw materials. But in order to do that, they destroy the lives of indigenous peoples and peasants. In Mozambique these days, we have a project funded by the Japanese and Brazilians that is going to expel 4.5 million of peasants of their land. They are not landless peasants. They are peasants with land. They are going to expel them to produce soybeans, or in this case, I think is palm tree, the oil of palm. So this, in my view, tells me that all the contradictions that I developed in the regulation emancipation chapter of Toward the New Legal Common Sense goes together with another duality. If you read the chapter carefully, you can see that for me is the tension between social regulation and emancipation. That's the main contradiction of Western modernity. What I know today is that this dichotomy, this tension occurs in metropolitan societies. Whenever there is the other side, the colonial side, there another tension operates. The tension between appropriation and violence. So regulation and emancipation goes together with appropriation and violence. And it's happening today. Because I don't have any other way of seeing that the nucleus of social democracy, which is Europe, does what Europe is doing in the Mediterranean, and saying that is the work of mafias. While all our policies made those states failed states. They were produced as failed states. They were not failed. And we don't have memory. Do you remember that Libya was the securest border of Europe many years ago? People from Africa would come through Morocco, not through Libya. Libya had an agreement with the European Union, and in fact the southern border of Europe was in the southern part of Libya. They dismantled Libya in order to get access to the natural resources. And of course, in order to have other questions, I'm not going to into that, but I'm ready, of course, to discuss that in the debate. And all of a sudden, all of them come through Libya. So it is a self-defeating type of strategy based on this duality that is not co-present. Regulation, emancipation on one side, the bright side of modernity, and appropriation violence on the other side, the dark side of modernity. And the two belong together. And what we have to do, an emancipatory law is an emancipatory law that really addresses the abyssal line. And it tries to eliminate appropriation and violence. Because I think that a struggle based on regulation and emancipation, without considering that on the other side there are appropriation and violence, will be self-defeating. Because we may be defeating in one country, but in fact creating misery in a different country. And if we take seriously the world as a unit of analysis, this is a very serious question to me. So I think that at this stage, what I want to convey to you, there were many ideas, of course, that come out of these epistemologies of the South, my analysis of all these innovations which are very important in these constitutions, of course, the process of deconstitutionalization that took place afterwards. But I think that we have to bear in mind a couple of things, and I end with these very, very general comments on how one could see the legal reformism now from the perspectives of the epistemologies of the South. On the idea that there are abyssal exclusions and non-abyssal exclusions. For instance, if you take the women's struggle, through this women's struggle, many women today in the world can fight their struggles within the realm of regulation emancipation. Struggle for new laws with democratic means and so on. But women in the hands of the Boko Haram or the feminicides of Ciudad Juarez, they are on the other side of the line. They are appropriation violence. For them, they are not viewed as enabling principles, people for emancipation. They are just property, and of course they are appropriated as violence. So the epistemologies of the South, what they do is to consider that probably the experience of these oppressed groups, they are good for them, but they are good for mankind in general, for humankind in general. The struggles of indigenous peoples, of peasants these days, they are not good for peasants. And in India, for instance, is a growing time bomb in India and in South Africa on questions of land because of that. It is not just good for them, it's good for humankind because of the incoming ecological disasters. Is it by chance that 75% of the biodiversity is in indigenous lands? They have been guardians of the biodiversity. And I think we should consider that seriously. So confronting that should lead to these four kinds of conclusions. First of all, I think that our knowledges, legal knowledge, scientific knowledge, I'm a social scientist, was a lawyer, so legal science, social science are very important, but they are incomplete knowledges. There are other knowledges in society, and we have to bring these other knowledges into our universities, in our research centers. There are no struggles that can be accomplished just by scientific knowledge. We need to bring non-scientific knowledge, popular knowledges, women's knowledge, knowledge of the movements, to build what I call ecologies of knowledges. And therefore, ecologies of legal knowledges. Second, take seriously the sociology of absences. That's part, I have a new book called Epistemology of the South, Justice Against Epistemicide. So I developed that at length. Is to analyze, and for students this is very important, for my students at least, is that to try to analyze our most cherished achievements from the perspectives of those that don't have them and probably never will have them. That's what I call sociology of absences. The other side of the line is absent, is made absent, non-existent. As women were for many, many, many centuries, as indigenous people very often are, undocumented migrant workers are, as asylum seekers are. So they are invisible in our societies. So let's look, for instance, at citizenship from the perspective of non-citizens. Let's look at human rights from the perspectives of humans considered by dominant politics as non-humans or subhumans. Consider the welfare state and social protection from the perspective of what I have called in Chapter 8, Can Law Be Emancipatory, the uncivil civil society, such as undocumented migrant workers, asylum seekers, the zones of non-being, and believe that these zones of non-being are not just the abstract categories, they are real people. The third one is that once you do the sociology of absences, you have to do the sociology of emergences. That is to say, try to value these other knowledges as a kind of way of expand our conversation of humankind. Because I think a lot of experience in the world is being wasted because we don't value it. We don't read it. You consider it's underdeveloped or is ignorant or whatever. I think we have to bring more people, more ideas into the conversation of humankind. Why? Because the understanding of the world by far exceeds the Western understanding of the world. It's as simple as that. And I'd like to discuss with you whether you agree or not with me. The understanding of the world by far exceeds the Western understanding of the world. So you take forms of human dignity that probably are not compatible with our conventional conceptions of human rights. Out of the forms. I've been working a lot with the concept of Ubuntu in Southern Africa. But Ubuntu doesn't fit into human rights. Should be dismissed? No. It's a variant of human dignity, a different way of looking. And I could go on, I can, of course, in the debate on the ontologies. Our ontologies, being alive or being dead, the individual, is a very, very parochial conception. I can bring you ontologies from other countries, from other regions, in which, in fact, there are three kinds of living beings, not just one. The living dead, and the living not yet born. This is the ontologies prevalent in Ubuntu philosophy, for instance. Why should that be dismissed? Because it's one thing of Africans? Well, quite frankly, I think it's very important that we give the stature of the living to the future generations. Living, not yet living. They are the future generations. So I think that if you take that, then Sociology of Emergence, of course, many people know from my work. I take it from a great German philosopher, the noch nicht of the principle of hope in Ernst Bloch. So, in my view, and I conclude, these epistemologies of the South force me, in a sense, to be more demanding on law and on the emancipatory potential. I'm not saying that law has not potential. It has. But I have to address the comfortable zone of law. The zone of comfort for law is regulation emancipation. Because what is social emancipation? It's a better regulation. That's what it is. But there are many people in our societies that are not subjected to this logic. They are subjected to the logic of appropriation and violence. And therefore, can law get out of its comfort zone and address the other side of the line? I think so. But we need to decolonize our law schools also. It's not the question of extending the university to the outside world. It's to bring the outside world inside the university. Other knowledges, other people. We have created in 2003 what we call the Popular University of Social Movements, in which we take, for 2 days, we get together, 40 people, 1/3 intellectuals, 2/3 leaders of social movements, to discuss issues of common concern. And you can go to the page of the Popular University, you can see the results of this, the photos, and it's a different way of producing what I call the ecologies of knowledges. Because science should not be afraid of confronting other knowledges, if for once it is considered as a relevant knowledge, but not the only knowledge. Because there have always been other knowledges in society, and there will always be. So I think that if we take that, and if I conclude, 20 years after toward the common sense and more than 10 years after toward legal common sense, I return to my roots to conclude that epistemology and utopia, which were relatively neglected in the second edition, have to be brought back. That will be the task of the third edition, probably. To be realistic in our dire times, to be realistic in our times, in my view, amounts to refuse to reduce reality to what exists in hegemonic terms. We have to have an expanded conception of reality that includes the sociology of absences and sociology of emergences. And that's based on the idea that much what is not relevant is made non-relevant or non-existent by our epistemologies. If taken seriously, such an expanded vision of reality would involve a profound transformation of our universities and research centers. This would be, of course, for sure, a very complex and difficult task. But having been a professor and a researcher for 50 years, I sometimes think that we have been training conformists, and very often incompetent conformists. I think it is high time for us to train competent rebels.